All right. I want to thank, I'd like to begin by thanking you for joining us today. I'm Laura Patrick, Chair of the Islands Trust Council. I was elected and I'm a resident of Salt Spring Island. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar-based town hall about the draft Islands Trust policy statement. This is an important opportunity for us to share information about the draft policy statement and to hear from you, residents, property owners, and other community members across the Islands Trust area and beyond. This draft has been in the works for a while, and it's now time to hear from you. How can we make it better? Joining me this evening are elected Islands Trust Executive Committee Vice Chairs David Maud from Main Island, Tim Peterson from Lasqueti Island, and Toby Elliott from Gabriola Island. And here this evening is the Islands Trust Chief Administrative Officer, Ruben Brownie, who will introduce the staff that are online. Good evening, Ruben.
Thank you, Chair Patrick, and good evening, everybody. Joining us on the staff side to support this conversation this evening, Director of Trust Area Services, Claire Frater, who leads the support for Trust Council on the policy statement project, Director of Planning, Stefan Cermak, Director of Legislative and Information Services, David Marler. I believe we have Senior Indigenous Relations Advisor, Joe Elliott, joining us this evening, Program Coordinator, Chloe Straw, Planning Team Assistant, Emily Bryant, our Communications Specialist, Morgana Van Nykirk, and last but certainly not least, our Senior Policy Advisor, Jason Yeomans, who has carried so much of the policy work on this project and will be walking you through much of it this evening. And I expect we have a number of other staff also listening and eager to hear from the community this evening. Thank you.
Thank you to the staff for joining us this evening. I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging with respect that the lands and the waters of the Islands Trust area have been home to Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. Their deep connection to these islands continues to this day. Islands Trust works within the territories of 31 Indigenous governing bodies and that have expressed interests in the lands and the waters of the Islands Trust area, and is committed to building respectful relationships and ongoing dialogue with these Indigenous governing bodies. I recently participated in the Penelakut First Nation March for Children to honor the children who died in the Cooper Island Residential School and to remember the impacts on the survivors. This event made a deep impression on me and motivates me to continue to be dedicated in furthering the work of reconciliation. Work to update the Islands Trust statement has been underway since 2019. In that time, and through a range of opportunities, the thoughtful ideas and constructive suggestions from island residents has been invaluable in helping shape the draft policy statement, and that we're here to discuss today. We're grateful for all the feedback we've received up to this point, and not just from community members, but also from Indigenous governing bodies and the agencies and organizations with whom we work with to achieve the Islands Trust object. And we're excited to spend the next few months between now and the beginning of February hearing from you. And we want to know, did we get it right? I'm pleased now to pass over the facilitation of this event to Brandy Svensson from Be the Change Group. As we head into the presentation and the question and answer portion of the evening, among other things, Brandy will walk you through how to use the chat function and to submit your questions if you didn't do so in advance. So thank you for being here, and I hope that you come away feeling better informed when you let us know what you think about the draft policy statement. Over to you, Brandy.
Thank you, Chair Patrick, and thank you, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here this evening and to be part of this conversation. So I'd like to also welcome you. We're so pleased to be hosting this event today and grateful that you've taken the time to join us. So today is an opportunity to learn together, ask questions, and share perspectives. We want to ensure that everyone has a chance to have their questions answered and engage in a meaningful way. I also want to remind everyone that you can also provide comments and feedback through the survey, which will close on February 6, 2026. We'll place a survey link in the chat now. And at the end of today's meeting, we'll also share details about upcoming on-island engagements, knowing that ongoing engagements happening and opportunities to have your voice heard. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the Islands 2050 webpage in the coming days. So if you want to revisit it, it will be there for you, or if you want to share it with your neighbors. Islands Trust is committed to a healthy dialogue where everyone's opinions are heard and valued. And we appreciate your help in creating an open, respectful, and culturally safe space for this conversation. For this reason, if questions or comments do not adhere to this, they will not be addressed here today. And if needed, participants may be removed from the meeting. But I trust this will not be needed, and I appreciate everyone's support and contributions. So our agenda for today, welcome, which I will be completing in a moment. Then we have a staff presentation from Jason Yeoman, as we've already spoke about. Then we'll move into the Q&A section of the evening. And then of course, we'll talk about closing and next steps and ways you can continue to have your voice heard. So that's a quick overview. And then I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping so everybody knows how to get their questions answered. I will repeat this a little bit later, but anytime you can submit your question for the Q&A to click on the chat. So let me show you this. So you should be able to see, if you see on the very bottom, there's a chat function, and you should have a chat bar that comes up, usually to the right of your screen. You'll have the option to either click on this blue button here, or for some people, they might see like a little blue with a pencil icon. If you click on that, then you will be able to say new chat. And for the sake of today, you'll be chatting with, you can see right here, you'll be chatting with Q&A today. So that'll be step 2. This will be a separate chat box for you to type and submit your questions. Question comments will be reviewed and added in the order they're received, with questions prioritized, and only those sent to the Q&A co-host will be considered. If the questions or comments are not pertaining to the policy statement, we will not address them today, but rest assured it will be forwarded to the appropriate staff or trustee and/or included in the engagement process. We value all your inputs. We want to make sure that anything you provide gets forwarded to the appropriate person. You will also see on the slide that there is a host named Tech Support. And this individual will be supporting you, who can message for assistance throughout tonight's meeting. We'll talk about additional ways you can receive technical support shortly. I'll be sharing a screen, so there's also a phone number if that's preferred. Great. Okay, perfect. So a reminder that after you send a question or comment, you'll need to click back on everyone in the chat. So you can see right here, you'll want to go back to everyone, and then that will help you see the main chat. And that's where we'll be putting the questions that we're answering today. So you'll be able to return back to there. And we kindly ask that you rename yourself in your Zoom. So if you complete, I think a lot of people have their names, which is amazing. But if you don't mind, to help us get to the community, we kindly ask that you rename yourself in your Zoom and include your island location if possible, because that will give us an opportunity to help identify you during the Q&A. To do this, you click on the participants at the bottom of your screen. My next slide here, sorry. Participants in the bottom of your screen, and then hover over your name to get the more. You'll see it here on the top right. And from there, you'll be able to select rename. If you experience technical difficulties, you can, as we mentioned, start a chat with the co-host named Tech Support. So same way that we started a chat with Q&A, or phone the number on the Islands Trust administrative team. So again, it's here, 250-405-5163. Great. So I do see someone's hand up, so I'm going to talk about that in a moment. So we are not doing hands up because we don't have, sorry, Jennifer, if you don't mind just either putting your chat in your question in the Q&A or to tech support. And finally, a reminder on the kinds of questions we'll be responding to today. So in the spirit of reconciliation, Island Trust ensures that all public meetings promote inclusion and honor Indigenous people. Staff, trustees, and members of the public all have the right to a safe and respectful environment. So racism, homophobia, misogyny, and personal attacks will not be tolerated. Such questions will not be answered. And again, if needed, participants might be removed from the meeting. Thank you again for being here today. With that, let's begin. I will now hand it over to Jason Yeoman, the Senior Policy Advisor at Islands Trust, who has a short presentation. And just so everybody knows as well, we know that some people might have seen this presentation, but really our goal for today is to make sure that we're all starting from the same place. So that is why we're having this presentation, to make sure that we all know exactly what we're talking about in a little bit of history. Great, over to you, Jason.
Thank you, Brandy. Could you just verify for me that my screen is being shared before I launch into things?
Perfectly, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jason Yeomans, and I'm a Senior Policy Advisor with the Islands Trust. I've been helping provide project management and policy development advice on this project for the past year. I've worked for the Islands Trust since 2013, and until recently, I'd also lived on Salt Spring Island for a decade. My son still goes to school there, so I know something of island life. I'm coming to you today from the territory of the Lekwungen people, now known as the Songhees and Esquimalt Nations, in the city that we call Victoria. Before getting into the policy statement project itself, I just want to provide a quick introduction to the Islands Trust that generally needs to precede any discussion about the work that we do. Islands Trust is a special purpose government responsible for planning and land use management decisions in the Islands Trust area, which is comprised of 13 major islands and more than 450 smaller islands and the surrounding waters in the Strait of Georgia and in Howe Sound. The Islands Trust does its best to preserve and protect these islands in the Salish Sea. They're grouped into 13 local trust areas, which each have their own local trust committee. There's a bit of subtlety to that, but I'm not going to go into that now, that make land use decisions for that particular group of islands using the land use planning authorities under Part 14 of the Local Government Act. There's also one island municipality in the Islands Trust area, and that's Bowen Island, which has a municipal council and all the powers of a regular municipality, and it has 2 members of its municipal council that sit at the Islands Trust Council table. When all 26 elected Islands Trust trustees come together, they do so as the Islands Trust Council to take into account planning for the region as a whole. The Islands Trust is a unique form of government, neither a municipality nor a regional district. Ultimately, it's a special type of government for a special place. The Islands Trust was created in 1974 by the government of British Columbia to protect these islands and their unique ecosystems and lifestyles from the rampant overdevelopment that was starting to emerge at that time in the form of small lot subdivisions on several of the islands. Islands Trust was established under the Islands Trust Act with a mandate or an object, as the legislation says, to preserve and protect the trust area and its unique amenities and environment for the benefit of the residents of the trust area and of British Columbia generally, in cooperation with municipalities, regional districts, improvement districts, First Nations, other persons, and organizations and the government of British Columbia. Within the Islands Trust Act, you will find Section 15, which says that the Trust Council must, by bylaw, adopt a trust policy statement that applies to the trust area, and that this trust policy statement must be a general statement of the policies of the Trust Council to carry out the object of the trust. The first Islands Trust Policy Statement was adopted in 1975. The current Islands Trust Policy Statement has been in force, I believe, since 1993. A lot has changed, not just in the Islands Trust area, but in Canada and in the wider world since that time. And in 2019, Islands Trust Council decided that it was time to update the Islands Trust Policy Statement to better help the Islands Trust navigate today's challenges and to take on tomorrow's opportunities. The slide on your screen right now shows basically what we would consider to be the policy hierarchy within the Islands Trust. The policy statement is our highest level policy document, which then is used to influence the development of official community plans, which set the vision for each of the local trust areas. Those official community plans are then used to create land use bylaws, which are the suite of regulations that apply to the land and the waters in a particular local trust area. And then, of course, that land use bylaw results in what you see around you on the islands where you may live. The Islands Trust Policy Statement is the foundation for the strategic planning that the Islands Trust Council does when it gets together to decide its strategic priorities for a given time period. It will generally look to ensure that it, in defining that strategic plan, is doing so to advance the objectives stated in the policy statement. The policy statement, as I just noted, informs the review of, oh, actually, I didn't note that part. Policy and statement informs the review of official community plan and regulatory bylaws by the Islands Trust Executive Committee. So it serves as a filter of sorts to ensure that within each of the individual islands, individual local trust areas of the island's trust, that those local trust committees, or indeed island municipalities, are managing their land use in a way that is consistent with the greater federation-wide vision as expressed in the trust policy statement. The policy statement is also used to inform the intergovernmental relationships that the island's trust forms with the province, with regional districts, with Indigenous governing bodies, or with any other organizations and agencies that we formally partner with. As an example of the type of intergovernmental relationship that the policy statement might inform, I think of the agreement that we have with the Ministry of Transportation, where our longstanding agreement with them sets a narrower road standard generally in the island's trust area than the Ministry of Transportation would typically apply in other rural areas of the province in recognition of the unique character of the island's trust area. Those of you who are here this evening may want to note sort of how the island's trust might impact you. If you happen to be a landowner in the short term, you will not notice any impact as a result of the adoption of the new island's trust policy statement, unless you were to apply to amend the official community plan and the land use bylaw as it applies to your land, in which case those bylaw amendments, when they're considered first by your own local trust committee or island municipality, and then eventually by Island's Trust Executive Committee, will be looking to ensure that those official community plan or land use bylaw amendments are consistent with the island's trust policy statement. Over the medium term, as local trust committees and island municipalities in the island's trust area update their official community plans and land use bylaws to bring them into alignment with the new policy statement, if and when it's adopted, this may ultimately result in changes to how land in the island's trust area or in a particular local trust area is used. It may result in more ways to use your land, less ways to use your land, or different ways to use your land, depending on the decisions that your local trust committee or island municipality makes in how it chooses to implement the new island's trust policy statement. In 2019, as noted, since 2019, a process has been underway to update the policy statement. This program to update the policy statement eventually came to attempt to achieve, I guess, three objectives that align with an effort to respond to declarations that the Islands Trust Council has made over the preceding years. So there are three primary topic areas in this update to the policy statement. It's reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, it's to address climate change, and it's to address housing challenges on the island. And these lenses or these topic areas respond directly to three things. The first is a reconciliation declaration that Islands Trust Council made in 2019. It responds to a climate change emergency declaration that Islands Trust Council made in 2019 as well. And it responds to a declaration of there being a housing equity crisis and workforce shortage on the islands that Trust Council has recognized. This is the project timeline for the policy statement update project. There has been a significant amount of public engagement throughout this project since 2019. Where island residents and others have been asked to weigh in on their perspectives on what should inform a new Islands Trust policy statement going forward. We're currently at the beginning of a 6-month-long engagement window on the policy statement, on the draft policy statement, during which time we've got a survey open both online and in hard copy. The paper copies are available at key locations on islands around the Islands Trust area. We're hosting events like this. We'll also be visiting individual islands to host on-island events in accordance with the wishes of local trust committees. And we've sent the draft policy statement out to the many Indigenous governing bodies and other government agencies with whom we work together to advance the Islands Trust object. In early February, we're going to aggregate all of the information that we receive through this 6-month window of engagement and present it to Islands Trust Council with recommendations for potential revisions that they might want to consider to this draft policy statement, in part as a result of what we hear during this time. Subject to whatever Trust Council decides, we're then going to enter a period of revision to the document, all in service of hopefully seeing a new Islands Trust policy statement adopted before the end of this political term, with the next round of local government elections, I think, taking place in October or November of 2026. This slide just shows a summary of some of the earlier engagement documents that have been produced through this project, and all of this information is available on our project webpage, which is the Islands 2050 webpage, which you can either just Google Islands 2050 and it'll get you to the page, or you can see the website address at the bottom of your screen right now. All right, so what's inside the new draft Islands Trust policy statement? There are three core elements. The first are guiding principles, and these are principles that should inform how Islands Trust Council makes its decisions. There's an expectation within the document that trustees will consider these principles as they develop their policy programs or as they cast their votes on various issues on their islands and at the Greater Islands Trust Council table. There are directive policies. These are things that Islands Trust Council thinks that local trust committees and island municipalities must do as they develop their official community plans and their land use bylaws. And then the draft policy statement also has a number of what we have termed advisory policies, which are things that Islands Trust Council thinks that local trust committees and island municipalities should do. Within the advisory policies, you'll find that they touch on issues that either are not within the direct jurisdiction of a local trust committee, or for one reason or another are sort of complex or complicated enough that it would be challenging, or there's potential challenges to the implementation of these policies. On the topic of reconciliation, I think anybody who's had an opportunity to take a trip through the draft policy statement will see that reconciliation with Indigenous peoples features quite prominently within the document. For example, the first of the guiding principles that you'll find near the front is that Islands Trust Council will acknowledge and respect Indigenous rights. It commits to grow understanding of the history and legacy of colonialism in the Islands Trust area, to acknowledge and respect the rights of Indigenous peoples, and to work together with Indigenous governing bodies and Indigenous knowledge holders to preserve and protect culturally significant areas, sites, and species. There is also a principle that commits Islands Trust Council to prioritizing environmental and Indigenous cultural heritage protection, that it place priority on preserving, protecting, and restoring the environment, and preserving, protecting, and supporting the restoration of Indigenous cultural heritage in all decision-making. At its most fundamental, this directive policy that local trust committees and island municipalities in all of their official community plan bylaws and other bylaws that require executive committee or trust council review or approval will cooperate with Indigenous governing bodies by engaging with them and providing a record of the engagement at the time of bylaw submission is a pretty fundamental directive policy. So it sets an expectation that local trust committees and island municipalities should be able to demonstrate to trust council that they have engaged with the Indigenous governing bodies that have territorial interests in that particular region. There's a suite of directive policies as well to ensure that decisions made by local trust committees and island municipalities, either on a site-specific basis or as part of wider policy programs within a particular local trust area or island municipality, are going to minimize any potential adverse impacts to Indigenous cultural heritage sites, to their marine harvesting areas, or to their land-based harvesting and hunting areas as well. Climate change is, I think it is addressed most strongly within the draft policy statement through the numerous policies that prioritize the protection of island ecosystems, both forests and marine ecosystems, which we know to be important carbon sinks or carbon sequesterers within the Islands Trust area. Notwithstanding that, we also understand that climate change is here today and that there are risks to the human communities that we have on the islands. And so we've ensured that within the draft policy statement, there are policies such as 3.4.6, which says that local trust committees and island municipalities must identify areas at elevated risk of natural and climate change related hazards and restrict development within those areas. There is also Directive Policy 3.5.20 about setbacks from the sea, which requires local trust committees and island municipalities to establish appropriate setbacks from the sea that reflect the best available information. No secret, I think, that housing looms large within our communities as a topic of interest to our local trust committees these days. And housing is addressed within the draft policy statement in the following ways. Let me backtrack momentarily to say the thing that we hear most often from our elected officials, and that they, I think, hear most often from constituents in the Islands Trust area, is that there is a lack of housing diversity within the islands, that the housing typology in the Islands Trust area is largely characterized by large single detached dwellings, and that form of dwelling, while perhaps characteristic of the way that the islands developed, is simply now out of reach for many community members, particularly sort of the working folks of the islands. Additionally, one of the major themes that we heard during public engagement early on in the project in the first phase highlighted the fact that island residents would like to be able to age in place on the islands, and that there isn't really a housing stock that is suitable for that sort of thing to be able to happen. And so I think there is an attempt within this draft policy statement to address this lack of housing diversity in the Islands Trust area. So it does so through a number of directive policies. The first is 3.411, which directs local trust committees and island municipalities to identify suitable locations that could support increased density for the development of safe, secure, diverse, and attainable housing. 3.4.12, which says that local trust committees and island municipalities must support a range of housing types and tenures to help meet the identified housing needs of the island community and local Indigenous communities. And 3.4.13, where local trust committees and island municipalities are directed to support alternatives to conventional single detached dwellings by establishing policies that could permit clusters of small dwelling units in suitable areas. So these are policies meant to, I guess, inspire or enable more creative solutions to the housing challenges, which our elected officials hear repeatedly is a major concern within the Islands Trust area. As far as the next steps in this project, as I mentioned earlier, we're in this 6-month period of engagement with island residents and beyond, referral agencies, Indigenous governing bodies. We will collect everything that we hear, and in the spring of 2026, bring that back to Islands Trust Council for their further consideration, eventually with the hope that there may be a new trust policy statement adopted by the fall of 2026. But of course, that is all dependent on how Trust Council chooses to respond to what they hear from all of you and from all of the agencies and Indigenous governing bodies that we refer this draft document out to, and the decisions that they make after that. Thanks. That concludes my presentation, and I believe we'll move on now to the question and answer period of the evening.
Thank you so much, Jason. I appreciate it. I also want to acknowledge I did see a hand come up. We have messaged you directly. We ask that any questions or that you may have that you will direct it towards a Q&A. So I know we've had some new people who've joined. So welcome. I'm just going to go through that process again to make sure everybody knows how we will be receiving questions, as well as some of the guidelines again for anyone who's new. So a reminder that questions can be submitted by starting a chat with the host name Q&A. You'll see in this visual here on the top right, you'll click new chat. For my screen, I have a little blue thing on the left that looks like a little pencil. I click on there, I do chat, and you'll be communicating directly to that Q&A. And we will be considered in the order of submission. So we will also be giving priority, as we mentioned earlier, to questions pertaining to the policy statement. So those answering the questions, please come off mute as relevant questions and comments arise. And a couple notes about the questions. So we will be prioritizing questions that were sent in advance. We provided this opportunity because we wanted to make sure that we made this event accessible. And we understand for some people, they aren't as comfortable with technology or Zoom. So we gave that option to individuals. We will prioritize those. I also do want to note that if you are experiencing any technology issues today, please go ahead and message, just as you would have the QA support, you can message the tech support, or if easier, you can call that number for yourself. They're there to support you for any issues that you may be having today. So some individuals pre-submitted several questions. So to ensure that we have an opportunity to ask questions and everyone has an opportunity, we'll answer one per person first, then open the Q&A chat. We will then return to the additional pre-submitted questions, time permitting, of course. So we hope we can get to everyone's question today. And finally, if we have more time at the end, we're on questions, we can open for comments in the Q&A. So our goal is to phrase the questions as you ask them. So as the question goes in the Q&A, the goal is that I will be able to read them out as you've done. If they're unclear, we'll try to get clarity from you in the Q&A chat. So we'll acknowledge received, but if someone needs to get clarity, we'll ask. We ask to support this, please try not to use acronyms. And if you can just reread your question before you press submit, because if you're anything like me, I always have to go back and edit my text because I pushed too soon. We will not be using the raise the hand feature today or taking participants off mute as we have a large number. We had over 200 people register. So we really want to make sure this gives equal opportunity to all participants to submit questions today. So if we run out of time today and your questions have not been answered, we will do our best to follow up via email and post some of these responses to the frequently asked questions section on the project website. As a reminder, your input is super important to us. We will also share ways for you to contribute to this process before we wrap up today. Jason mentioned some of those. We'll make sure we share a slide and give you opportunities. So on this note, we are going to begin with the questions. So I'm going to stop sharing. So I will be going through, as we mentioned, the questions that were, some of that were pre-submitted. And then I know there's been lots of questions coming to Q&A. So thank you already, everyone, for participating. And I'm going to go ahead and start the Q&A section. So the first question came to us from Julia. The affordable housing has been replaced with attainable housing. There are lots of homes that are attainable if you have a lot of money. Where are you making this change? And I will hand this over to Jason to begin answering the question.
Thank you, Brandy. I appreciate the opportunity to start with this question, and then we'll see whether any of the elected trustees want to jump in on it as well. Thank you, Julia, for your question. This was a change that was initially recommended by staff to reflect in part what we were hearing as a trustee commitment to addressing the workforce housing shortage that we have on our supply-constrained islands. The BC housing definition of affordable housing is housing that is considered affordable when 30% or less of your household's gross income goes toward paying for your housing costs. And I think the reality on the islands is that for many working class households, affordable in that BC housing definition is a tough bar to meet unless the housing development is built using some sort of government subsidy. And we know that there's a finite supply of that government support these days as the need is high all across the province. The alternative would be supply side increases of market rate housing at a volume that would be required to make housing affordable by that definition for all who need it, if indeed such a thing could even be possible in a desirable location like the islands, in the Islands Trust area. And trying to address housing affordability entirely through a supply side solution could result in a scale of development on the islands that would be inconsistent with the Islands Trust object. So it's staff's hope that by using the term attainable housing in the draft policy statement, then maybe that will enable more creative land use changes or housing solutions that can enable additional types of housing or additional types of dwelling units that may not meet the BC housing definition of affordable, but that would nonetheless help address the workforce shortage and housing equity crisis that exists on the islands.
Please go ahead, Toby.
Sure. And thank you for the question, Julia. I'll give you an example from Gabriola Island because it's a context I'm most familiar with. On Gabriola, we are just seeing the first affordable housing development under construction right now that will allow 24 units, and that is secured with an affordable housing agreement. This was made possible with a 100% provincial subsidy, a lot of work from our trustees and MLAs, and about a decade of work by very diligent nonprofit organization and community members. But our community knows this is not enough. We need units of housing available for workers, families, elders in smaller numbers and in suitable locations. For instance, where land is already zoned for a more intensive use. And as an example, there's a current rezoning proposal to allow expanded commercial uses on Gabriola Island in the village core. And the LTC is requiring the addition of 2 units of residential housing to be added to the proposed development. Now, this has received first reading, so it still has to go through community's input and everything. But to note related to this question is that trustees elected not to require an affordable housing agreement. And this was in part because the proponent wasn't wanting to put residential housing there. And so this is sort of a way to increase the potential for worker housing in a space that's already being used for commercial development. This housing could be rented at market rates, used for family or for worker housing. And it was really just felt that this would be too onerous to put on the proponent to require an affordable housing contract, which is really the only way to secure that as affordable is to put that on title. So we're trying to find any way that we can to make very small incremental increases in housing that are tied to already, I guess, intensity of use in appropriate areas for a community that's in dire need of any kind of rental housing. And this is one way that it can happen, and it might not otherwise be achieved. So thanks for the question. I don't know if other trustees want to weigh in.
Thank you so much, Toby. I also just want to acknowledge that it's come to my attention that there was some loss of power in some of the islands. So we have lost one of our co-hosts today. So David Mott unfortunately dropped off because of power. So just acknowledging that has happened. Thank you so much for answering the first question, Jason and Toby. I also noticed we had some newcomers. So I'm just going to reshare my screen to make sure everybody knows how to submit questions today. So if you would like to submit a question, please go ahead and click on here, new chat. Or for some people like myself, it's a little blue button with a pen looking thing. You click on the new chat and then you go ahead and submit your chat to Q&A. And then when you want to go back to the main chat, which will show the questions that are being answered, which I'll also be reading out, you'll go back to this everyone. So thank you and welcome to everyone who's new. Now I'm going to go ahead and read out the next question. So Maxine from Salt Spring Island, on page 25 of the policy statement, it says that the trust requires that bylaws submitted to Islands Trust Executive Committee must not be approved by Executive Committee if they are contrary to or at variance with the policy statement. This has been interpreted to apply only to those policy statement policies called directives, which is fine. But this section of the law is contrary to the statement in this policy statement on page 7 that says bylaws, quote unquote, should be consistent with the policy statement, that the policy statement only provides a general statement of policies. Why isn't the policy statement following the Trust Act and requiring bylaws to be consistent with the policy statement directives? I'm going to ask if one of the trustees would like to respond to this. Jason, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, I'll get the ball rolling on this.
Thank you.
All right, so we know that the Islands Trust Act says that a bylaw submitted to the executive committee or referred to the trust council must not be approved by the executive committee or the trust council, as the case may be, if it is contrary or at variance with the Islands Trust policy statement. So the Islands Trust Act, in directing the Islands Trust to create a policy statement in the first place, does not say anything about requiring directive policies. Directive policies are something that the Islands Trust has developed over the years as the mechanism by which Trust Council can ensure that local planning decisions on each of the islands advances the Federation-wide vision for the trust area. All of these directive policies begin. Local trust committees and island municipalities shall, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These directive policies over the years have also enabled the creation of an evaluation tool that trustees and staff use to assess whether a proposed bylaw is consistent with the policy statement. We call it the directives only checklist, and it asks, does the proposed bylaw meet, or how does a proposed bylaw meet each of the directive policies? However, at the end of the day, and barring any legal action that sees a question of policy statement consistency elevated all the way to the courts, the decision about whether a local bylaw is consistent with the policy statement is a political decision. And executive committee can deem a local bylaw to be consistent with the policy statement as a whole, even if it doesn't meet all of the directive policies. Or it can determine that a bylaw is in fact consistent with a directive policy, even if others might suggest that it is not. So I think the policy statement and other corresponding Islands Trust policies could be updated to say that a local bylaw must comply with every single directive policy in order to be considered consistent with the policy statement. To date, the draft policy statement does not say that. And I guess in my decade of experience here at the Islands Trust, I think many trustees would find that to be kind of an unreasonable fettering of their discretionary decision-making authority, whereby they need to or want to be able to balance different considerations into whether or not a proposed local bylaw is consistent with the greater Federation-wide vision as they apply it through the decisions that they make. Hopefully that was a satisfactory answer. Thank you, Maxine.
Thank you, Jason. Any of the trustees like to add to that?
I'll jump in. I think what's
Thanks.
important too is the implementation plan. So on page 27 of the trust policy statement is an implementation plan, and there is a commitment to develop or to revise a revised assessment tool so that the Islands Trust Executive and the Islands Trust Council can use to assess whether Islands Trust committees and Island Trust municipality bylaws are contrary to or at variance with the policy statement. So that's work yet to be done, and I know we'll always be seeking feedback to make sure we create a tool that will really work well.
Excellent, thank you. So the next question is a three-parter. Jason, would you like me to do it in 3 parts, or would you like me to read them one at a time?
Let's go one at a time and see what happens.
Okay, it might help, yeah, because they're quite long questions. So I don't have that memory. So all right, so Keys from Gabriola Islands. For the introductory paragraph in part 2.1 of the draft trust policy statement states, the Trust Council is committed to being guided by the 7 quote unquote shared general guiding principles and decision making by all the entities other than the Islands Trust Conservatory under the Act. So the question related to that statement, A, are local trust committees also committed to being guided by these principles in their decision making? Jason, I'll hand it over to you.
I would say yes, insofar as the preamble to those principles says that these principles should guide daily planning and decision-making by Islands Trust Council, Islands Trust Executive Committee, local trust committees, and island municipalities. So the policy statement does commit local decision-making bodies to apply these principles in their decision-making.
Great. Would any of the trustees like to add to that? Please go ahead, Toby.
Sure. There has been considerable debate, I think, among council as to how to incorporate guiding principles and how strong the language should be, such as guided by, informed by. And so it's upholding principles when you're serving in government is, I would say, an interpretive exercise of how you evaluate different types of decision of material when it comes to making a decision. Trustees elected to, in particular, this special purpose government are accountable to uphold not only directive policies that support the object of the trust, but many other guiding principles such as good governance, transparency, accountability, and responsible conduct as an elected official. But quantifying how those principles are followed in making a decision would be quite a challenging task. And so when it comes to principles such as acknowledging Indigenous rights, cooperating with others, working towards collaborative governance with First Nations, these are all critical to the functioning of good government. And I'd say the result is in how effectively is that local trust committee governing. But it would be challenging, for instance, to make a guidance principle such as cooperating with another elected body in making a decision that is in the authority of that local trust committee, which has total autonomy and authority in land use planning and decision making, without fettering the discretion of trustees and that decision making body. So I think there must be some latitude in giving guidance, being informed by all these different principles and bodies of law without unduly restricting elected officials or the elected body. Thanks for the question, Kate.
Thank you so much for the response. I have a part two. Christina Evans, I just want to note that we're not asking for raised hands or comments at this point. So please, even if it's pertaining to this, we will definitely note it and can come back to it. If you can please put your question in the Q&A chat towards so if you go over there, you add a chat and you go directly to Q&A. So thank you. We'll be sure to address.
Apologies, I am a trustee trying to weigh in.
Oh, I am so sorry. That is my bad. Sorry, Christina. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Apologies, I wouldn't have said anything otherwise. And I do apologize as well. I lost power and I missed part of what was being said by Toby Elliott. So I think when it comes to the guidance principles, yes, the local trust committees are going to be guided by these principles, as will Trust Council. And the guidance is broad enough for to be applied as is necessary given the situation. It provides a little bit of latitude without it being so strict as to say, this is exactly how it is to happen, which is why that word is being used. And it's an advisory versus directive. And I apologize if that was a repeat, but thank you.
No, thank you. And again, my apologies for that. I saw you join the room, so I missed that. So thank you for that. I'm going to go to the second part of the question now. If so, will principles 2.1.2, 2.1.3, and 2.1.5, all of which could be reasonably applied to land use decision making from part of the bylaw checklist used by the executive committee?
I will take first crack at this by saying that consideration, I think as Chair Patrick noted already, consideration of what a revised bylaw checklist might look like is still in its very early stages. We haven't created even a draft document yet, really, just a working document. I would not recommend that the principles be added to the checklist, as they are context to inform trustee decisions, to set out a direction of travel. And as Trustee Elliott alluded to, they would be very difficult, I think, for anybody to measure as to whether they had been adequately implemented or not. Thanks.
Thank you. Any additions before I go to part 3 of that question? Okay. Note that Principle 2.1.6 is incorporated into the Directive 3.5.25, i.e. consider cumulative effects of docks. So will presumably be on the bylaw checklist. Why not the others?
Sure. The reference to cumulative effects in relation to docks was not included as a directive because it appears as a principle, but rather it was included at the explicit request of one or more of the Indigenous governing bodies that have provided feedback on the draft policy statement to date. And that's why it appears in this policy and not anywhere else. It was something that had been specifically requested by some of the Indigenous governing bodies that had provided advice to date. Staff are quite cognizant that there is a need to understand the cumulative effects of land use changes in the trust area. And I think in the next year or two, you're going to see work underway to understand what resources are needed by the Islands Trust to better do so. And I think you'll, if you watch the budget process this year, you'll see a business case going forward related to monitoring and indicators and helping better understand the islands. Thanks.
Thank you. So that's it for the 3-parter there. I do encourage people, if they have questions from the answers, you're more than welcome to ask questions in the Q&A. So our next question is Sybil from Gabriola Island. Could the more flexible rules about what farming activities are allowed and what housing is allowed in the agricultural land reserve also be allowed in agricultural and rural resident zones? When looking at affordable and special needs housing, rather than prescribing duplexes, could the policy statement allow more flexibility, such as clusters of tiny /small homes or other options that are suitable to location, circumstances, community need, and new developments in and cost of construction? I'm going to hand this over to Trustee Elliott. Toby.
Oh, hello. Surprise.
Hello. Thank you.
I always get these questions and I love them.
Perfect.
But if other trustees want to answer, this is an area that I definitely am interested to see how it develops and how community responds to that. So draft policy currently in this draft of the policy statement 3.4.14 was developed for this very purpose, which articulates clustered small dwelling units that communities are to support alternatives to conventional single detached dwellings by establishing policies to permit clusters of small dwelling units in suitable areas. Could the rules be more flexible? Yes, but that is where the discretion of each community and where the latent development already is, and how it's directed through the OCP. So how forms of development, which are appropriate for certain locations of the island, I think that's best determined by the local trust committee doing an OCP review. Some committee members are doing a suitable land analysis, which is a way of mapping and layering the different ecosystem assets, where intensity of use already is and where we might want to direct intensity of use away from to preserve and protect certain areas that have ecological, cultural significance. But how this can work out as a policy in OCPs, it's been quite interesting to see its development. So for instance, on Main Island, which I chair, it's in its second phase of a housing review, and an attempt to support some housing diversity. It's created some really innovative solutions that really this directive policy would 100% support. So for instance, the LTC has directed staff to develop draft zoning for a clustered residential zone and small unit residential community. These have not received first reading. This has just been direction to staff from the LTC because of the need for different types and forms, as Jason said, of housing typology that aren't the single family dwelling or the accessory dwelling / cottage or multifamily dwelling units. So we're also seeing staff develop draft language for alternative housing models such as detached residential units. Proposed language for this is, in addition to principal commercial uses in appropriate locations, second-story residential dwelling units or detached residential units may be permitted in order to provide a mix of housing types and to encourage residences closer to services and amenities. This doesn't really respond to your question of farming and agricultural uses so much, but I really think that's really going to be at the discretion of the LTC in the development of their OCPs. So I think the goal of increasing housing diversity and allowing flexibility and support for small detached units in whatever way they appear is really, it's opening that door for flexibility while not requiring it, and then saying, well, it's up to the LTC to direct where that would go. So maybe I can throw it to some of the other trustees. I've been very lucky to see how it is working out on Maine and Gabriola Island where I serve.
Thank you, Trustee Elliott. Does any other trustee want to speak? And I see Sybil was there nodding, so it's nice to see a face of someone who asked a question. Anybody else have any comments they want to share from the trustee side? Okay, with that note, I'm going to go to the next question. Jorge and Maria from Galeano Island. Why is climate change mitigation not a goal with directives and advisory policies in the draft trust policy statement? Jason, I'll hand it over to you to start.
Okay, thanks, Brandy. Some of these questions noting the absence of certain things, the answer is potentially very simple, which is that so far there hasn't been political direction to make that happen. Nonetheless, within my presentation, I think I noted a few of the ways, and potentially the most important ways, that climate change mitigation is addressed within the policy statement, first and foremost through the ecosystem protection policies that populate the document. When we think about the contribution of our islands to climate change, the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions are things, now, notwithstanding the ecosystem protection regulatory authorities that our local trust committees have, the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions on the island are only indirectly within sort of the regulatory purview of the island's trust. So, and I'm using Transition Salt Springs Climate Action Plan for Salt Spring Island as my reference document here, which summarizes the source of GHG emissions on Salt Spring Island, or estimates the sources of GHG emissions on Salt Spring Island. And the first one is simply the on-island transportation system, right? Emissions from our tailpipes. And there isn't a great deal that Islands Trust can directly do to mitigate those sorts of emissions, with notwithstanding or with the exception of the fact that it can advocate for better active transportation networks on the island. Now, of course, the Islands Trust does not build active transportation networks, but it can certainly ensure that its policy documents support the construction of active transportation networks and provide whatever sort of advocacy support is needed to ensure those are constructed on the islands. And it can also change its residential land use patterns such that perhaps people need to drive less. If you put people closer to the services that they are typically driving to, that is another way that the Islands Trust has some authority over tailpipe emissions. The second largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions on the islands, at least according to Transition's Climate Action Plan, is through our building stock. basically energy inefficient buildings on the islands. And that's not something that Islands Trust has direct regulatory authority over. Certainly new construction is going to have to adhere to the BC Building Code, and we know that the BC Building Code is requiring increasingly efficient buildings year over year. And there's not a great deal that Islands Trust could do about the existing stock of buildings on the island. And then the third highest source of greenhouse gas emissions on the island is through land clearing and the sequestered carbon that's released at the time of land clearing. And that is potentially something that's within Islands Trust regulatory authorities, and hopefully the policies in the policy statement supporting protection of the island's ecosystems, both forest and marine, will continue to ensure that the majority of that sequestered carbon on the islands remains so. Thank you.
Thank you. Would any trustees like to add anything to that?
I'm happy to. I think the trustees did have a lot of conversations about climate change and how to have it show up in the policies. And I think they generally felt stronger putting the policies embedded in the various areas, because climate change is across everything that we do rather than into its own area. So I think that was the driver.
Thank you. Great, go ahead. So I see we have Jamie Harris and just, oh, sorry, no, that's a participant. So Jamie, we're asking that any questions or comments that you have, we'd like to receive them. So please put them in the chat under Q&A. So just go to your tab, add a chat and send it to Q&A and it will be added for us. Thank you. Please go ahead, Trustee Elliott.
Yeah, I would just note that there is a directive policy related to climate change mitigation and adaptation. As Jason said, the tools that we have are limited, but the proposed policy 3.4.5 is to implement planning and land use management strategies and consider nature-based solutions to minimize greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to climate change related vulnerabilities. But as Jason stated, a lot of the pieces that are related to services are carried by the regional districts, and they have much more, I would say, stronger lists of climate change policies. But I would certainly say that Jorge and Maria, if that's a gap that the Islands Trust can and I would say must meet through the authorities that we have, I would say put that in as a recommendation for change if you don't feel that's strong enough. But I think that's definitely a key focus for Islands Trust. We want to make sure that that's upheld without being aspirational. We have to be extremely practical with the policies that can actually have regulatory effect.
Great, thank you. All right, any other? Okay. All right, I am going to go ahead and jump to the next question. So Peter, I don't have the island, but I have Peter. This is a longer question, so bear with me, and please, anyone who's responding to it, let me know if you would like me to repeat the question. Islands Trust Policy 5.9.2 at 2.4 states in part, a local trust committee does not have jurisdiction over matters that fall within federal or provincial jurisdiction, such as resource extraction, navigation, or water quality. The draft policy statement at the section of marine shorelines has paragraphs that appear non-compliant with paragraph 2.4 above. They include 3.5.19, aquaculture tenures that are under federal and provincial jurisdiction, 3.5.22, vessel moorage that is under federal and provincial jurisdiction, 3.5.23, marinas that are under federal and provincial jurisdiction, 3.5.24, sharing of coastal facilities that are under provincial and federal jurisdiction, 3.5.25, don't worry, I'm almost done, marine docks that are under federal and provincial jurisdiction, and finally 3.5.26, marine structures that are under provincial and federal jurisdiction. Please explain this apparent conflict. Jason, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Brandy. that was indeed a long question, and prepare yourselves because this is going to be an even longer answer.
Okay, great. And we've also put it in the main chat for you as well.
Okay. So the policy cited by the author of the question, hello, Peter, is basically a statement of fact. The Islands Trust can't regulate things that are the exclusive jurisdiction of a higher level of government. But what constitutes exclusive jurisdiction is a bit muddy. I sort of will launch into a quasi legal monologue here and try not to get too far out over my skis in answering this question. So here we go. The common law protects the right of navigation, which gives mariners free and unobstructed passage through navigable waters. But this is not like an absolute right to navigate anywhere at all times. It's not like an inviolable individual right like you find in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's a right that's bestowed by the federal government through its laws. So while someone could suggest that all the docks, marinas, breakwaters, and other infrastructure that we see around our shorelines impede your individual right to navigation, the federal government has, for the most part, deemed these to be an acceptable imposition on your right of navigation, that these things, while they may impede your ability to transit the shoreline, the federal government says it isn't actually a violation of your ability to navigate. Doing anything that may impede these rights, this right to navigation, whether it's an individual doing it or a corporation or other level of government, requires the blessing of the federal government. They control the right to navigation on the open waters. In our local context, the waters between Vancouver Island and the Lower Mainland are considered to be inland waters, and that gives the province the power to legislate over the seabed and waters on matters within its jurisdiction, provided that the federal government doesn't determine that those legislative efforts of the province collide with the federal government's jurisdiction over things like shipping or hydrocarbon extraction and that sort of thing. So that leaves things like marinas, docks, aquaculture, and the like to be within the authority of the provincial government to regulate in a way that it chooses, provided that that doesn't collide with the federal government's navigation and shipping powers. So the provincial government is the body that issues tenures and leases that allow places in and over the water to be occupied by things like docks and marinas and aquaculture tenures and that sort of thing. All of the things that Peter had listed initially in his question as a concern. So that leaves local governments and the role that they play, or that the Islands Trust plays, over the marine area. So we know that Part 14 of the Local Government Act enables local trust committees and island municipalities to zone for a range of uses. They can, by bylaw, divide the whole or the part of the municipality or regional district, or in this case, Islands Trust area, into zones, name each zone and establish the boundary of the zone, limit the vertical extent of a zone and provide other zones above or below it, and regulate the following within a zone: the use of land, buildings, and other structures, and the density of the use of land, buildings, and other structures. And in the Local Government Act, the definition of land includes the surface of the water. So the Local Government Act tells us that local governments in British Columbia have the authority to zone the water surface and permit or not permit uses of their choosing. The most prominent court cases where the jurisdiction of local governments over the surface of the water has been confirmed are West Kelowna versus Newcomb in 2015 and City of Victoria versus Zimmerman in 2018, both of which concerned long-term moorage of boats and their use as dwelling units in water areas that municipal zoning said didn't permit it. And in both cases, the court sided with the local government, confirming that while short-term anchoring is a right that's protected under federal navigation laws, using a boat as a house is a use that's subject to local government zoning. So putting this all together in the Islands Trust context, the provincial government can authorize new infrastructure like a dock or a breakwater along the marine foreshore and near shore, so long as the federal government deems that it is not an unreasonable imposition on the right to navigation. But the province will typically but not always, defer to local government zoning and only issue such a permission where local government bylaws deem that proposed use to be permissible under the local regulatory authority. I think it's important to note for the author of this question that the draft policy statement and the previous policy statement has been referred to all relevant provincial and federal government departments. So that includes water, land, and resource stewardship with the province, which is the side of the province that issues marine tenures, and to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, which I think is the primary federal body that oversees how our seas are used. And in their review of the draft policy statement, if there's anything that raises concern for them, they'll let us know and we'll report back on the results of that referral to Trust Council to ensure that whatever we do is consistent with other levels of government's understanding of our authority and jurisdiction over these matters. Thanks.
Thank you. Any additional? Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I just add, Jason touched on a bunch of the legal bits there, and it really underscores why the cooperating with others is so vital because of this overlapping jurisdiction with marine issues. But it is incumbent upon us to have policy in place so that when we are working to with the other levels of government and other agencies to look at solutions and consider how we address arising problems in the marine environment, that we have the policy backing us up to guide those conversations.
Thank you. Anything additional, Trustee Elliott or Patrick? Okay, I'm going to go to the next question. Kevin is asking, why is the trust actively involved in Indigenous land use and entitlement when this is wholly a federal and provincial issue? I'll hand this over to Jason to start us.
Okay, thanks, Brandy. This is similar in some ways to the previous question about marine jurisdiction, which is about overlapping responsibilities of various levels of government. So while Kevin is correct that matters related to the relationship between settler institutions like the Islands Trust and Indigenous people and their governing bodies are primarily the purview of the federal and provincial governments. The world is changing fast, and there's a growing expectation that local governments do a better job of building relationships with the Indigenous governing bodies over whose traditional territory those local governments now exercise some form of jurisdiction in the current legal framework. As I noted during my presentation, Islands Trust Council has made a reconciliation declaration within which they commit to establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And while this is a political statement of intent, which I think tells you the direction that Islands Trust wishes to travel, there's also an operational reality for us as well, which is that we are a quasi-Crown agency. And so amendments to the Islands Trust policy statement and to the official community plans that flow from it require the sign-off of the provincial minister responsible for the Islands Trust. So our bylaws go to the minister, who is these days the Minister of Municipal Affairs. And it's been our observation over the years that the minister, via his staff or her staff, as the case may be, essentially looks for two things when they receive an Islands Trust bylaw. The first is the proposed bylaw amendment contrary to the provincial interest or jurisdiction in some sort of way? And secondly, has the Islands Trust duly engaged with the Indigenous governing bodies that have territorial interests in the area? Can we provide a record of what we heard during this engagement with those Indigenous governing bodies? And can we demonstrate to the province that we did something, or if we didn't do something, that we at least communicated that back to those Indigenous governing bodies? So the province doesn't necessarily require that Islands Trust implement all the recommendations that we receive from Indigenous governing bodies when it comes to amending our various bylaws. But if we don't, they've set out an expectation that we should have a good reason for it and have communicated that reasoning to those Indigenous governing bodies. all of this to say that while the duty to consult may rest with the Crown in the case of the Islands Trust, the groundwork for that duty to consult has really been delegated to the Islands Trust. Like, the expectation is that we're on the ground doing the work of engagement around our own bylaws, even if ultimately those bylaws require sign off by the Minister of Municipal Affairs. I also would like to note briefly that in April 2025, the Minister of Housing and Municipal Affairs wrote to the Islands Trust and said, over the balance of their term of office, I will need the Trust Council to take particular care to ensure that engagement with the public and First Nations on the bylaws put before me for approval, including amendments to the official community plans and the Trust Policy Statement, are undertaken in a manner that demonstrates mutual respect and builds towards consensus. So that's pretty explicit instruction, I think, from the minister, whose signature is needed to bring our bylaws into law, about the role that he expects Indigenous governing bodies to play in the high-level policy work of the Islands Trust. So in sum, while a strict reading of constitutional responsibility would suggest that the Crown-Indigenous relations take place at a level or two above the Islands Trust, the day-to-day reality is different. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. Tim, Sir Elliott, Chair Patrick, or Chair Peterson like to share anything else on that?
Well, I think Jason outlined the legal parts of that quite clearly. And the minister's words are very straightforward. The minister approves the bylaws and the trust policy statement, and has explicitly there stated that the ministry wants to see evidence of engagement with First Nations, and much like the situations we see at the provincial and federal level, it's much more it's a better approach, a wiser approach to work directly to build those relationships where we can, rather than undervalue or underappreciate the importance of those.
Thank you, Trustee Peterson and Trustee Elliott.
Just a final note is that the reality is that we are functioning and making land use decisions within the territories of 30 plus First Nations. Whether there is a duty to consult at the local government level, the practicalities are that we must engage in order to do our work in a good way. And it's written right into the object of the Islands Trust. The Islands Trust is to accomplish this function of land use planning on behalf of the province and all of British Columbia in cooperation with First Nations, regional districts, everybody. We cannot do this work alone. And so we are bound by the object that sets out how we are to do this work, by our constitutional responsibilities, and the operational realities of living and working within these territories. Thank you for the question. It's a really good one.
Thank you so much. Chair Patrick, can I hand it over to you just to speak to any hand raising that's been happening, please?
Oh, no, thank you. Again, I'm so glad to see so many trustees on the call this evening. Just a reminder that we have such limited time today that our questions are being focused on or answering questions from the public, and the vice chairs are the primary and as well as staff for answering the questions this evening. So trustees, you're here to listen and hear what our conversations are tonight, and you have lots of opportunity to talk at our various meetings. So thank you.
Thank you, Chair Patrick, and thank you everyone for being so engaged and raising hands and sending questions. We really appreciate it. And a reminder for anyone who's joined us, with you people are still trickling in, which we really appreciate. And we know some people have lost power. Please, if you have a question today, if you'll go ahead and add new chat and add it to the Q&A for your question. So for that next question, Jennifer from Galliano Island. Goal 3 of the draft policy statement states that ecological integrity is essential to the island's trust object and to support community well-being. And that, quote, the policies in that section aim to identify and protect key ecosystems, types, and characteristics that safeguard biodiversity and promote resilience to climate change. Why is there not a clear definition in the draft that environment means natural environments? I'll hand it over to Jason to kick us off.
Thank you, Brandy. The answer to this question is succinct, which is that at the Special Trust Council meeting of July the 29th, a motion was put forward that the proposed definition of environment that was in the glossary at that time in the draft policy statement, which I think many people agreed didn't quite hit the mark, be removed. And that motion was approved by the majority of trustees that attended that meeting.
Great, thank you. Oh, please go ahead, Trustee Elliott.
I will add that this is it's not particularly difficult to define environment as the natural environment. However, when you get to the jurisdiction of, for instance, at the provincial level, the Ministry of Environment, we were searching for a definition, like if anyone's going to hold the ultimate definition of what environment means in the province of BC, which the Islands Trust should put in its glossary, it should be in the Ministry of Environment. And because it's separated into such micro, somebody help me with the word, there isn't one all-encompassing definition of environment, and it was felt that it would be just, it's almost useless to put in a definition that was going to be unsatisfactory, but is actually pretty well understood. So it was causing so much back and forth over whether it's the natural environment, but really our parent agency, the province, doesn't have one holistic definition. So it was moved to remove that. But I think it's fairly well understood that the whole ecosystem and all that supports the natural environment is really understood to be environment.
Thank you, appreciate that. All right, so I'm going to move on to our next question. Ronald, why is public input being rushed and tightly managed in these ways? The policy statement is long, complex, and controversial document with potentially serious consequences for all islanders and the Islands Trust. Go ahead, Jason.
Thank you, unless any of the trustees wanted to jump in, but hello, Ronald, thanks for the question. The window to engage with Trust Council on the draft policy statement has been open since early August and will remain so until early February. So it certainly doesn't feel rushed to me. In fact, it's actually unconventionally long, I would suggest, by local government standards for a document at this stage of development. The primary vehicle by which Trust Council is collecting community feedback on the draft policy statement is through the online survey, which remains open until February. The survey has many opportunities for open-ended responses where you can share whatever you would like within the limits of respectful communications about the draft policy statement. Members of the public are also welcome to share their perspective with Trust Council at its quarterly meetings, one of which takes place next week on Gabriola Island, and the one after that scheduled for December. The email addresses of your elected trustees are available on the Islands Trust website if you want to reach out to them directly that way. And at the end of this meeting, we'll be sharing a list of local engagement events, the style of which was selected by each of the local trust committees that was asked how they would like to engage with their local public on their island around the draft policy statement. If this question is from the Ronald that I think it is, I think you may be a resident of Salt Spring Island, in which case the Salt Spring Island Local Trust Committee has requested 2 in-person events, and those will take place during the month of October on Salt Spring Island. I can't remember the dates right off the top of my head. Tonight's meeting is, I will admit, being rather tightly controlled, and that's really just primarily a function of the fact that it's difficult to accommodate such a large crowd using an online platform in a constructive way. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. And just to remind everyone as well that if there's comments that come in that aren't necessarily speaking to the policy statement, that all comments will be directed and forwarded. So anything that you bring in today will be responded to or looked at in some way or the other. Great. Any additions to what we just spoke of before I jump? Please go ahead, Trustee Elliott, and then Chair Patrick.
I'll defer to the chair here.
Oh,
Okay, thank you. Please.
I was gonna say, this is our third round. We've been out to speaking with the public for twice before to lead up to this document. So this is sort of the result of what we've heard. Those reports are on the website, and this is the next round to see, did we get it right? Did we hear what you had said to us?
Yes, and as mentioned, we will share a link later as well as the URL to go to the webpage to see all the engagement that's been completed, and that will continue to go. Please go ahead, Trustee Elliott.
And I would just say that in managing a large process like this has required a lot of steps that executive committee staff, we've been mulling over how to best do this, how to present the information in a way that's understandable and so that we can capture everyone's input. But in my many years of experience with surveys and community engagement, it's often that the longer the engagement period is, the time for questions and surveys, the more people fall off and actually tend to forget that there's something going on. So often, while this document is complex, it is lengthy, it will have implications for islanders and residents and visitors. The process leading up to this has been quite we've been thoughtful about how to do it, but the 6-month engagement process, I would say, is the outer limit of what the public can sort of attend to without losing interest and, really not understanding what was the whole point. So this 6-month period was at the request early on so that we could give communities adequate time to really read through everything, come to their local trust committees. Many local trust committees don't meet often for 3 months. And so it was felt that this would give us basically double the amount of time which originally had been envisioned so that we could really engage, answer those questions, learn what's important without exhausting everybody with endless rounds of consultation. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, and thanks for sharing your knowledge and expertise in the area. So I'm going to jump off to the next question. So John from Victoria, what effect, if any, will the agreement between Sept Nation and the province have on the policies of the Island Trust? And will there be changes to the land use policies due to this agreement? Apologies, I have a siren in the background here. I believe the islands affected that fall within the Sept COA dock management plan area would be included in the Gambier Trust area or land use bylaw. Jason?
Yes. Apologies to John. This is the one pre-submitted question that I don't have a prepared or particularly articulate answer for. A quick trip through the agreement referenced by the author suggests that the province is changing the way that dock tenures are dealt with in this management area in cooperation with the Sept Nation. To date, I am not aware that we've been instructed by the province to amend our policies or regulations to align with this management agreement. But sort of back to my earlier response about overlapping marine jurisdiction, if Islands Trust existing regulations don't align with whatever this new provincial agreement with the Sept Nation calls for, then those local government regulations are only of force and effect to the extent that the province decides they are going to be of force and effect. I would look to any of the directors who are on the call today if you have some additional information about this management plan that I'm not privy to and that you are able to share. Thanks.
Right. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next question. France from Salt Spring Island. The draft policy statement contains 2 definitions of density. Calculating density using floor area ratio is very different from determining density by counting the number of dwellings. Floor area ratio is a densification strategy for fully serviced urban areas, while the number of dwellings approach is more appropriate for rural areas that are protected by special conservation-oriented legislation, and where it is essential to limit the human population. What is there in the draft policy statement to ensure that floor area ratio and other urban densification strategies, such as flexible zoning, are strictly limited and not broadly applied to residential zones on the island? All right, Jason.
Okay, I'll take a start at this, and then perhaps a trustee or two can jump in. So I actually hold on to your hat, France. I think you're correct. I think as we move this document forward, we may want to consider whether floor area ratio is an appropriate density metric in the Islands Trust area, at least outside of village cores. I would encourage you all to Google floor area ratio and sort of how it works, and it doesn't really make a great deal of sense on larger rural lots, or even anywhere outside of a dense urban core where it serves a particular purpose, which is creating different potential higher density building configurations to ensure a variety of different building types in an urban context. So I take what you say, and we'll bring that forward for the consideration of Trust Council as we move forward. To the second part of your question about what strictly limits the use of tools like flexible zoning in the draft policy statement, I would say it is proposed Directive Policy 3.4.11 that island municipality or LTCs and island municipalities must identify suitable locations that could support increased density for the development of safe, secure, diverse, and attainable housing. So the direction to local trust committees and island municipalities from Trust Council is that if they are going to consider increased residential dwelling opportunities, that those be in suitable areas. What is a suitable area? Islands Trust, and I think Trustee Elliott, or Vice Chair Elliott, mentioned this earlier in the evening, that the Islands Trust has been developing a suitable land analysis tool, which is a mapping tool that will stack all of our available data around ecosystem protection, around hazard areas, around water availability, all of the things that we have in our inventory of data in the organization, to identify areas where increased residential uses may or may not be important, depending on, or be advisable, depending on how that suitable land analysis is set. I would encourage the author of this question to check out some of the housing policy projects that have been taking place on Main Island for the last year or two, and that are currently taking place on Gabriola Island, and perhaps Trustee Elliott will speak to this, for an example of how this land suitability analysis approach to where is or is not necessarily a good place to put more stuff in the Islands Trust context might work. The fact that Trust Council's proposed direction to local trust committees and island municipalities to facilitate more diverse housing options is naturally going to be balanced against or with all the other directive policies in the draft policy statement around ecosystem and Indigenous cultural heritage protection. And those form sort of a natural break on the sort of unrestricted or unrestrained development, I think, that the author seems to be concerned about in the question posed here.
Thank you. Please go ahead, Trustee Elliott.
Yeah, I would just add that the tools that we have are admittedly limited, limiting the impacts of residential development by number of houses or dwellings or structures on a lot is certainly one way. But some local trust committees have gone the route of limiting house sizes, which I understand is not floor area ratio necessarily, but house sizes in terms of, well, we already have this, accessory dwellings can only be a certain size, or cottages are defined as being under a certain square footage. And so the way to control or limit impacts on the land, the approach that certain trust committees are taking, such as South Pender, Maine, perhaps Gabriola, we'll see, we're still in the middle of our OCP review, is that if the local trust committee is going to allow more dwellings they want to limit the size of those dwellings and so reduce the potential impact to the land. So this is seen on Main Island with the flex housing zone. I can just read off a little bit for those that are unfamiliar. Sorry, just let me scroll back to the note about flex housing. Oh, sorry. Anyway, I don't want to take up too much time, but it is an approach that's being tested, I would say, and we really do need to see if this will have a measurable impact in limiting impacts on the land base. But lot coverage certainly is a very well-established limiting factor, as well as house sizes and number of houses. So these are all tools that we need to implement in different and creative ways in order to uphold the preserve and protect mandate.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to jump to the next question. So I have a question from John from South Thormanby Islands. Will there be any changes to the bylaw violation enforcement process? Will there be any changes to better prioritizing the issuance of bylaw violation notices? Go ahead, Jason.
Sure. I'm just going to start this off by saying that this is where I'm going to begin to sound far less intelligent because we are now on to the town hall submitted questions as opposed to the pre-submitted ones. So my script has run dry. The policy statement will not in and of itself affect bylaw enforcement within the Islands Trust area, but I believe that Director of Planning Services, Stefan Cermak, is on the call today, and he can perhaps, if he is willing, describe some of the bylaw enforcement and compliance review that has been taking place, or perhaps any of the trustees who are involved in the committee where that work is currently taking place. They may want to touch briefly on that. Thanks.
Sure, I'll just jump in there since, thanks, Jason. So hi, everybody. I'm Stefan Cermak, Director of Planning Services. Just to answer the question, the policy statement isn't directly addressing bylaw compliance and enforcement. However, we do have a specific program happening via Trust Council with the bylaw compliance enforcement policies review. You can find more information online, or you can send me a direct email at scermak@islandstrust.pc.ca, and I'll forward you the information. And all the policies and best practices are currently being reviewed. It is going to Trust Council next week for discussion, so you can look on the agenda package for what that looks like. And a further note that individual local trust committees can prioritize bylaw compliance and enforcement activities within their respective local trust areas. That again is part of the review practice. So if you need more information, happy to take that offline from the policy statement question that we're addressing today.
Appreciate that. And do you mind just putting your email in the main chat so everyone has access to it as well, Stefan? Thank you so much. Perfect. All right. So next question, Jill. With over 60% of shopping done online, I can't read that there. Just give me 1 second, please. With over 60% of, sorry, someone's just typing below the question. If we could just stop for 1 second because your name is hovering over it. Thank you. With over 60% of shopping done online, what type of commercial development is being considered necessary on the Southern Gulf Islands? I see you unmuted, Jason. You're going to try this one?
Sure. I am, the determination, I guess, of what the commercial land use needs are of any given island are going to be determined by the local trust committee that is responsible for that island or has jurisdiction over the land use planning. I don't think the policy statement implicit, or the draft policy statement, if it were adopted, implicitly leads to a revision or a review of whatever the current commercial lands regulatory regime exists on any given island. I think it will be up to a local trust committee if they choose to engage in that topic, if they see that there's sufficient community need to revisit or visit this topic of commercial land uses and commercial land needs on the island. they're certainly going to be free to do so. And whatever changes that they propose to make through such a process would need to be consistent with the policy statement. But I don't think the adoption of a new policy statement necessarily flows to a revisiting of commercial land use zoning or needs on the island. I know that doesn't sort of directly get to the author's question here about the relationship between island commercial needs and online shopping, but that's essentially how it would work. If the local trust committee or island municipality identifies that there is some sort of challenge in their commercial environment, they would then look at what potential land use solutions might be needed to that, and it becomes a planning project for them that needs to be consistent with the policy statement.
Sorry, I just muted myself. All right, thank you. I'm going to jump to the next question. So we have a question from Ruth from Gambier Island. Biodiversity loss is an equal threat to climate change. Given this process started in 2019, how has the goal to protect threatened ecosystems and the nature needs HAS objective been incorporated? Many of the islands are within Canada's priority places where ecosystems are fragile and threatened. Is protection of biodiversity still a key goal and priority in the preserve and protect mandate? Great. So do we have any of the trustees who'd like to respond to this? Elliot, go ahead, Chair
I'm
Patrick.
sorry, I'm happy to jump in there.
Please.
I think it's critically important. I'm going to borrow or reference a First Nations phrase. You take care of the place takes care of you. And we are deeply committed to the protection of the ecosystems of the islands because that is what is so critical. I'm trying to go through the policy statement in front of me as we speak, but the ecosystem integrity section talks about all of the various types of ecosystems that are highly valued. There are all kinds of ecosystems, but they are very specific of what is highly valued and needs to be prioritized and protected on all of the islands.
Thank you. It's a great question and great answer. Thank you so much. Next question is from Francois from Salt Spring Island. Groundwater is not a renewable resource in the commonly understood sense of the term. Replenishment often requires generations. Geologists agree that plumbing groundwater therefore does not meet the definition of sustainable use. Given the requirements to preserve and protect, quote unquote, the current water surge on the islands and the incursion of saltwater into wells at risk, how can one reasonably discuss increased population density? Jason, I'll hand this to you if you want to take a stab at it.
Sure. Thank you, Francois, for the question. I would encourage you, if you haven't had an opportunity yet, to check out particularly goal number 5 in the draft policy statement, which is the goal to foster sustainable stewardship of lands and waters. And within that, you will find a selection of policies related to freshwater that touch on some of the issues that you raise in this question. I think if you, I'm assuming you have some knowledge or expertise in this area, if you review those policies and think there's something lacking in them, we would encourage you to tell us that either via the survey or via email to our Islands 2050 email address if you have a suggestion to improve the policies. But I would like to highlight, just for everybody who's with us today, draft policy 3.5.1 called Freshwater Sustainability, which calls on local trust committees and island municipalities to ensure that neither the density nor intensity of land use is increased in watersheds where the quality or quantity of the supply of fresh water is likely to be inadequate or unsustainable. So while Trust Council would like to see some of the housing diversity challenges on the islands addressed, it should be in a context that it's not doing so at the expense of or in a way that may compromise the freshwater supply on the island. And on the subject of freshwater intrusion, there is Directive Policy 3.5.4, which calls on local trust committees and island municipalities to identify areas at elevated risk of saltwater intrusion and restrict development serviced by groundwater within those within these areas. And I would like to clarify, just because I know the word restrict can cause some alarm bells to go off. That doesn't mean necessarily that you can't do what your zoning currently permits you to do today. I think a way that would largely be interpreted is that local trust committees in island municipalities shouldn't be making land use changes in such a way that the intensity of development is going to increase in these areas. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jason. So just want to acknowledge that any questions that anyone has will be submitted through the chat. So if you would then push new chat and go to Q&A. We've actually completed the pre-questions as well as new questions today. So if you submit a question right now, we will have time to address it. So please go ahead and say new chat, Q&A, and then we will add that into the queue. So we have time for more questions, but I'm now going to return, as we mentioned at the top, we did receive a number of pre-questions from people. So we asked our first question, and now we're jumping on to some of those additional questions from the pre-submitted questions, and we're still open for new questions. So I'm going to jump back into those. So we have keys from Gabriola Island. Principle 2.1.3 in the draft policy statement refers to the rate and scale of development to carry out the trust object. The comparable current policy statement, fourth bullet under guiding principles, refers to the rate and scale of growth and development and must be carefully managed and may require limitation. The revised principle deletes the reference to quote unquote growth. Why has growth, quote unquote, and why has the ending phrase, quote, and may require limitation, end quote, been removed? Jason, please go ahead.
Sure. It's a short answer, and that's that in an earlier phase of this project, that policy was redrafted in an effort to sort of plain languageify it and make it consistent with the phrasing of some of the other principles. The draft policy or the draft principle says that LTCs will define and maintain appropriate limits, whereas the policy that's in the current adopted version of the policy statement says may require limitation. And I think those both seem to be saying roughly the same thing, that limits are expected. Thanks.
Thank you. On to the next question, a longer one, so bear with me. Franz from Salt Spring Island has another question. Many islands in the trust area have OCPs that identify population growth as the key factor influencing sustainability. This is especially true on Salt Spring, where our OCP has a very definite policy limiting the number of dwellings and, by extension, the overall human population. Yet, nowhere in the draft TPS and the word population, quote unquote, mentioned is the word population, quote unquote, mentioned. In fact, the new definition of density and the lack of requirement to clearly define a limit to growth very much undermine the whole idea of limiting population. How can the islands be protected if the human population is not limited? From the history of the Islands Trust, as described in our existing policy statement, quote, between 1974 and 1987, the area's resident population increased by 60%, far exceeding the growth rate in adjacent areas, end quote. Please note how growth is described in terms of population increase. Like the policy 5.2.5 on not exceeding OCP density limits, this important history has been deleted from the draft policy statement. Why? Right, can I hand it over to Jason?
Okay, I'll jump in really quickly with why the history was deleted from the draft policy statement. The history section of the current adopted draft policy statement and the earlier draft policy statement was deleted as an effort to address a trust council resolution to simplify and reduce the length of the document in its earlier draft version. And so that is why the history section no longer appears in this version of the draft policy statement.
Thank you, Chair Patrick.
I'll go. I'll let Toby go first.
Okay, sounds good. Please go ahead,
You go
Trustee
ahead.
Elliott.
She's going to let me go. All right.
Okay.
Population, dwellings, all of these things have changed in the way or not, population hasn't changed, but the way dwellings are used, occupied. We've always had a kitchen. A kitchen defines a dwelling. And people live differently than they did 30 years ago or even in 1974. And most of the zoning that's in place today in the Islands Trust was created prior to the Islands Trust even being established. And that was done with no consideration of ecosystem protection. I'm keen of the draft policy, advisory policy that we now have in this draft that addresses existing development potential, and that we identify land where current zoning or other land use regulations allow development that could be inconsistent with the object of the trust, and consider policy and/or regulatory options to reduce development potential or minimize the impacts of future development. Each local trust committee is obligated to assess and understand their housing needs and to plan for the next 5 and 20 years. And it's not easy. And it's not easy doing it in islands. And we need to look at, as Toby referred to earlier today, about clustering, using smaller spaces for our homes, putting them together, and using other ways to make sure we have that diversity of housing. And Toby, I'll let you add.
Sure. Yeah, it's like you said, we're coming from a place of very limited tools and moving to hopefully implementing science-based measures in order to produce those indicators of where is housing having, or where is development having a negative impact on the land base, where do we need to regenerate, restore ecosystems because they're been damaged, where do we need to protect and carve off areas for regeneration. So limiting density is certainly one way to counter the harmful impacts of growth. Limiting human population, however, does not appear to limit the potentially degrading impacts of humans on the land. I have argued in an article about the term carrying capacity that it may not be as important to quantify how many humans are on the land base as the kind of activities and development that those humans are allowed to enact. Those can have substantially greater impacts or less, depending on how they're directed. So for instance, limiting the number of humans can be helpful in some respects. It does spread out the potential impact, but this has also led in the islands to a phenomenon called rural sprawl. So the tools that we have to confine density, to confine development to certain areas that can handle it, creating development permit areas, nature reserves, direct development away from certain areas and to others. Other than that, the previous tool we had was to keep lots relatively large. But this has a knock-on effect of increasing the value of properties, which can tend to make this less accessible to certain segments of our communities, which have historically lived and built and provide services and who want to age in place. So if we really want to change how we're living in the islands, perhaps we can look at not how many people live here, but how do we live? Can we drive down the trends for bigger and more resource-intensive homes that are spread out from one another, which increase the amount that people drive, which in turn creates impacts like climate change? And finally, I would just say that population control is not a tool for a land use planning agency to do. It would be a poor and inappropriate exercise of our powers. The Islands Trust regulates land use and human activity on the land where it should and should not occur. So I think it's most effective to regulate how humans live and direct where they live rather than how many. But that is a very key question for our age, and it's one that we wrestle with all the time.
Thank you. Okay, I am going to move us to our last question. I know we said we'd wrap at 8:30. We might go a little bit over here, but we have this one question we want to answer. I would like to acknowledge too that we were able to answer almost every question that came in. So I really appreciate everyone coming and submitting questions today. And also acknowledge that we have some pre-submitted questions. There's quite a number from some individuals, and we are going to make sure those answers are responded to. I'll talk a little bit about that afterwards, but I will do the next question for now. So Steve, the suitable land analysis is a computer tool being used to determine areas suitable for additional dwelling units. In particular, it seemed the data model presented at the meeting on Denman Island wasn't particularly accurate. To what degree does the Islands Trust plan on using this tool to make policy? And will the tool be updated as better information becomes available? Maybe Jason, you can help me direct this question.
Yeah, well, I see that Stefan has appeared on camera, so I think Director
Okay.
Zermack is probably closer to the development of the suitable land analysis than I am, so may have some insights on it. So I defer to him. Thanks.
Perfect.
Thanks,
go ahead.
everybody. So the suitable land analysis is a new tool in name, but it's how we apply it as a new name. It's taking the information we have within the Islands Trust and using it to assess potential, queries, such as where may it be suitable to increase potential densities or intensities of land use. It is only a tool. It's only as good as the information we have, and it is being piloted in its current format, as mentioned on Denman and other islands going through major OCP projects. It's a transparent process whereby each LTC and through the public community may be able to discuss what it is, what it isn't, what it can and what it cannot do. And it is only one tool of many tools. So please don't think the suitable land analysis is a stopgap magic algorithm that says more density can go here. It is absolutely not that. It is our attempt to make it easier to communicate what our current information, such as the information we have available about water, about what we know about protected areas, and what we know about other things of zoning and build-out maps. It is meant to start a discussion with the community so the community can tell the elected officials where they think more density intensity can go. And to that degree, we will constantly be looking to update the tool as we learn to use it better. As we improve our mapping systems, we're under-resourced in GIS right now, so we're doing our best to keep up with that. And we really look forward to your feedback on Denman, on Maine, on Gabriola, and other places using the tool. And it is in its infancy in its current format, and absolutely we look forward to improving that. But I'll constantly remind people it is just a tool, and it's only as valuable as the information we're able to put into it. And it's meant to start discussions. It's not meant to be a magic AI algorithm that tells us where to put homes. It's not that at all.
Thank you. Appreciate that. We're having great questions this evening. So thank you for jumping in to those great questions. So this does bring us to our time. So I want to see, before I talk about the next steps, I want to see if Jason or Chair Patrick want to add any closing remarks.
That would be me.
That would be you, please.
I really want to thank you for all your questions. We are out of time for tonight. If you have questions that haven't been answered yet, please email them to the islands2050@islandstrust.bc.ca. Questions and answers from today's session will be made available on the Islands Trust Islands 2050 Frequently Asked Questions webpage. Public engagement on this draft policy statement is ongoing until February 2026, and we encourage you to complete the online survey about the draft policy statement, which is linked from the 2050 page on the Islands Trust website. So again, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Chair Patrick. So everyone can see on this slide here, I'll leave it up for a minute as we end. I just want to also acknowledge that we were able to answer almost all the questions that came in today, which makes us really happy, and appreciate your time on this beautiful Wednesday evening. Please note that the questions that were pre-submitted will be responded to and or put onto the FAQ page. So please go ahead and take any note of something that's happening in your local area. And I hope everybody has a beautiful evening, and thank you again.